Can you send a gift to heaven?
The question floated through the air like a snowflake, soft and delicate, and landed somewhere deep in Dan Wu's chest where he thought nothing could reach anymore. He blinked behind the cheap Santa beard, his rehearsed ho-ho-ho dying in his throat before it could form. For a moment, he forgot he was sitting in a shopping mall surrounded by artificial trees and screaming children. He forgot about the community service sentence that had put him here. All he could see was a pretty little girl, looking at him like he held the keys to something wonderful. She was so small. That was the first thing Dan Wu noticed. Small and neat in her gray vest, with her hands folded together like she was praying or maybe just trying to keep herself from shaking. Her dark eyes were warm despite the sadness swimming in them. And when she smiled, barely, just a tiny lift at the corners of her mouth, it reminded Dan Wu of sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Heaven, he said gently, testing the word. It tasted like childhood, like memories he'd buried so deep he sometimes forgot they existed. His mother used to talk about heaven on Sunday mornings while making breakfast, her voice full of peace and certainty. She believed in it completely, believed in goodness and light, and places where broken things got fixed. Dan Wu had inherited her dark hair and her stubborn chin, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost her faith. Until now, looking at this child, he almost wanted to believe again. The girl nodded, and her bow, that impossibly bright green bow, caught the Christmas lights and seemed to glow. My mommy went there last month, she said, and her voice didn't crack. She was being so brave, so incredibly, heartbreakingly brave. I got her a present, but the lady at the store said they don't deliver to heaven. So I thought. She paused, and her small face filled with hope so pure it made Dan Wu's eyes sting. I thought maybe Santa could do it, since you can go anywhere. Dan Wu felt his heart do something it hadn't done in 2 decades. It softened, not broke. Breaking implied something violent and painful. This was different. This was like ice melting in spring, like frozen ground remembering how to grow things. He looked at this little girl who'd just lost her mother, who was standing in line at a mall Santa not to ask for toys, but to make sure her mom knew she was loved, and something fundamental shifted inside him. The noise of the shopping mall faded into a gentle hum. The crowd of parents and children waiting in line seemed to blur at the edges. Even the headache that had been building behind Dan Wu's eyes for the past hour disappeared. All that existed was this moment, this child, this question that was really a prayer wrapped in innocence. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Dan Wu asked, and was surprised by how natural the endearment sounded. He never called anyone sweetheart, never used gentle words or soft tones. But this little girl deserved gentleness, deserved someone to be careful with her heart. "Zoe," she said, and smiled a little wider. "I'm 7 3/4. Almost 8. "Zoe," Dan Wu repeated, and the name felt important somehow. Special, like something he needed to remember. "That's a beautiful name. My mom picked it," Zoe said proudly. "She said it means life in Greek. She taught me that." Her smile flickered, and Dan Wu saw her fighting to keep it in place. "She taught me lots of things." The tightness in Dan Wu's chest grew stronger. He'd spent the morning listening to children rattle off wish lists with the emotional depth of shopping catalogs. But Zoe wasn't here for herself. She was here for her mother, to honor her, to love her even though she was gone. It was the kind of love Dan Wu had spent 20 years trying to forget because remembering hurt too much. His own mother had died when he was 11. Older than Zoe, but not by much. Old enough to understand death was permanent. Old enough to feel the hole it left behind. She'd been protecting him, putting herself between her son and the violence that eventually swallowed them both. The gang members had already scattered into the dark. His mother's blood had soaked through his shirt, warm and terrifying. Dan Wu had carried that guilt for 2 decades, let it transform him into someone hard and cold and feared. He'd told himself he was being strong, being practical, being a survivor. But looking at Zoe, he realized he'd just been hiding. Okay, besties, Dan Wu spent 20 years running from his past. It took one brave little girl to show him the way back. If this moment gave you chills, you're not alone. Drop a red heart below and hit the subscribe button. Also comment where and when you're watching from. Now back to the story. "Zoe," Dan Wu said quietly, leaning forward in the big Santa chair. "Your mommy sounds like she was very special. Tell me about her." Zoe's eyes brightened, grateful that someone wanted to hear. She was. She made the best pancakes, and she always sang while she cooked. Even if she didn't know all the words, she'd just make them up. A small laugh escaped her, sweet and sad at once. And she gave the best hugs. The kind that made everything feel okay, you know? Danwoo did know. His own mother had hugged like that. Like she could protect you from the whole world just by wrapping her arms around you. For a moment, he let himself remember, really remember, without pushing it away. The warmth, the safety, the feeling of being loved so completely that nothing else mattered. "Mom, please don't leave me," he begged that night, holding her hand while sirens wailed in the distance. "I need you. Please." But she couldn't stay. She'd used her last breath to whisper, "Be good, Danwoo. Promise me you'll be good." He'd broken that promise within a year. The streets had taught him that being good got you killed. That love made you weak. That the only way to survive was to become harder, colder, more ruthless than everyone else. He'd built an empire on violence and fear, telling himself his mother would understand. That she'd want him to survive, even if survival meant becoming a monster. "I do know," he said softly. "Those are very special hugs." "It was really fast," Zoe continued, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to pool in her eyes. "The doctor said she didn't feel any pain, but I don't know if that's true or if they just say that to kids." She took a shaky breath. "This is my first Christmas without her. She always made Christmas special. We'd make cookies together and watch old movies, and she'd let me open one present on Christmas Eve." Danwoo's hands gripped the armrests of the Santa chair, so hard his knuckles turned white beneath the red gloves. Around them, the mall continued spinning. Shoppers rushing, cash registers dinging, holiday music playing on endless repeat. But in this small bubble, time moved differently. Gentler. Parents in line had stopped checking their phones. A few were wiping their eyes. Even the teenager managing the camera station had set down her equipment, watching with her hand over her heart. "I saved my allowance," Zoe said, reaching into her vest pocket and pulling out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny heart charm. "It's not expensive or anything, but Mom always wanted a nice bracelet. She said maybe one day when we had more money, she'd get one." Zoe's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought if Santa could take it to her, she'd finally have one." The bracelet caught the Christmas lights, sending tiny sparkles across Zoe's palm. Danwoo stared at it, and something inside him shattered. He saw his 11-year-old self standing in the rain at his mother's funeral, holding the cheap flowers he'd stolen from a corner store because he had no money, wanting so desperately to give her something, anything, to show her he loved her. But she was already gone, and all the flowers in the world couldn't bring her back. "My mom always said." Zoe's voice wavered. "She said Santa listens to children who are sad, that he comes for the kids who need magic the most." She looked up at Danwoo, her eyes shining with desperate hope. "I really need magic right now, Santa. I really need her to know I love her." Danwoo reached up and slowly pulled away the fake white beard. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe because Zoe deserved honesty. Maybe because hiding behind costumes suddenly felt wrong. Maybe because something about this moment required him to be real, even if Real meant showing the world a face that usually made people afraid. The crowd around them gasped. He heard someone say his name, his real name, not Santa. But he didn't care anymore. But when Zoe saw him, the real him, with his dark eyes and his face that had forgotten how to smile, she didn't flinch. She just looked at him with that same trust, that same hope, that same beautiful belief that goodness still existed in the world. His hands were shaking as he stood from the chair and lowered himself to his knees on the platform. The red suit bunched awkwardly around him. Parents in line pulled out their phones, but Danwoo barely noticed. He was eye level with Zoe now, and all he could see was himself at 11, broken, grieving, trying to be brave when the world had just ripped his heart out. "Zoe," he said, and his voice came out rough and raw, "I think your present is going to get to your mom. Want to know why?" Zoe nodded, leaning closer. "Because love doesn't need Santa's sleigh or magical reindeer. It doesn't need wrapping paper or stamps or delivery trucks." Danwoo gently touched the bracelet still resting in Zoe's small palm. "Love travels faster than anything in the world. Every time you think about your mom, every time you remember something she taught you, every time you smile because of a memory, that's the gift reaching her. That's you sending your love all the way to heaven." His voice broke on the last words. Danwoo felt his eyes getting warm, felt something cracking open inside him that he'd kept locked for so long. Your mom is watching you right now. I promise you that. And she already knows about this gift. She knew about it the moment you decided to buy it. Because mothers always know. Even from heaven. A tear rolled down Zoe's cheek, but she was smiling. Really smiling. Really, really, Danwoo promised, and meant it with every broken piece of his heart. Around them, the mall had gone quiet. A woman near the front of the line spoke up, her voice soft but clear. He understands her. Look at him. She turned to the person next to her. My cousin lives in his neighborhood. She says he paid for her son's surgery last year. Sent the money anonymously, but she found out it was him. He fixed the community center roof, someone else murmured. Wouldn't let them thank him. The whispers spread through the crowd. Stories Danwoo had tried to keep hidden, small acts of protection he'd told himself didn't matter. Guilt payments, he'd called them. Meaningless gestures that couldn't balance the scales. But watching Zoe's face, seeing the way she looked at him with trust and gratitude, Danwoo felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Connection. Real human connection. The kind that didn't involve fear or power or transactions. Just two people who understood grief, standing together in a shopping mall decorated with plastic joy. Zoe stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around him, hugging him tight the way only children can, with complete abandon, without holding anything back. Danwoo froze for a second, then slowly, carefully, hugged her back. His arms, which had done terrible things, which had broken bones and destroyed lives, held this small child like she was made of glass and starlight and light. And for the first time in 20 years, Danwoo let himself cry. For the first time since his mother died, Danwoo felt something he thought was lost forever. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be good again. The news spread through Westfield Mall like fire through dry paper. Within minutes, every shop employee, every security guard, every parent in the building had heard about what happened at the Santa station. Danwoo, the man whose name made grown men nervous, had cried while holding a little girl, had removed his beard and knelt on the platform, had spoken about heaven and love like he actually believed in them. Danwoo stood slowly, still holding Zoe's hand, and became aware of the crowd watching him. But their faces had changed. The fear that usually followed him everywhere had softened into something else. A mother near the front of the line was openly crying. A security guard who'd been keeping his distance all morning had moved closer, his hand over his heart. Even the mall photographer had abandoned her station to watch, mascara streaking down her cheeks. That was beautiful, someone said. I didn't know he could be like that, another whispered. Danwoo felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with removing the beard. His whole life, he'd carefully controlled what people saw. The violence, the power, the cold efficiency. But in 5 minutes with Zoe, he'd let them see something real. Something vulnerable. And he couldn't take it back. Come on, he said gently to Zoe, his voice still rough from crying. Let me take you back to your family. Zoe nodded and tightened her grip on his hand. They walked through the mall together. The feared Mafia boss in a wrinkled Santa suit and the little girl with the green bow. People moved aside, but not out of fear this time. They smiled. Some even reached out to touch Zoe's shoulder or whisper words of comfort. Danwoo's bodyguards materialized from the food court, confused by the procession, but following at a careful distance. They found Zoe's grandmother near the toy store, frantically searching. She was elderly, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her coat worn but clean. The moment she saw Zoe, relief flooded her face. But when she saw who was holding her granddaughter's hand, she froze. Danwoo recognized that look. He'd seen it 1,000 times. The way people's bodies went rigid when they realized who he was. The calculation in their eyes. Should I run? Should I be polite? What does he want? But before her grandmother could speak, Zoe ran forward. Grandma, Santa helped me. He said Mom already knows about the bracelet. He said love travels faster than sleighs. The old woman's eyes moved from Zoe to Danwoo, uncertain. He still wore the ridiculous Santa suit, the hat crooked on his head, the red fabric wrinkled from kneeling. He probably looked insane. He certainly felt insane, standing in a shopping mall, his reputation in tatters, his carefully constructed armor shattered by a 7-year-old girl. Mrs.? Danwoo began. Chun, she said quietly. Margaret Chun. Mrs. Chun. Danwoo moved closer, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Your granddaughter is remarkable. And I want you to know. He paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like a threat or a promise he couldn't keep. I will always make sure Zoe is safe. Whatever she needs. Whatever you need. You have my word. Margaret Chin studied his face for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. I've heard things about you. Bad things. She glanced at Zoe, who was still beaming. But I've also heard you've helped people in the neighborhood. Quietly. When you thought no one was watching. Danwoo had no response to that. He'd never wanted credit for those acts. They'd been guilt payments. Insufficient attempts to balance scales that could never be balanced. Mr. Danwoo? Zoe's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was holding the small bracelet again, the tissue paper folded carefully around it. I want you to have this. Zoe, that's for your mother. No. Zoe shook her head, her green bow swaying. You said love travels fast. Mom already got my love. But you. She stepped closer and pressed the bracelet into his palm. Her small hand closed over his large, scarred one. Mom used to say that people who hurt others are the ones hurting inside. She said the meanest people are usually the saddest people. Zoe looked up at him with those wise, too old eyes. I think you're hurting too. So this is for you now. Danwoo stared at the bracelet, the small heart charm catching the fluorescent lights. His throat closed up again. He couldn't remember the last time someone had given him something without expecting something in return. Couldn't remember the last time someone had seen his pain instead of his power. Thank you, he managed to whisper. A crowd had gathered. Parents and children from the Santa line, mall employees, curious shoppers. A young boy stepped forward nervously. Can I take a picture with you? The real you, not Santa. Danwoo blinked, confused. Why would you want that? Because you made her feel better, the boy said, pointing at Zoe. My dad died last year. Nobody ever talks about it. But you talked about it. You made it okay. Before Danwoo could respond, other children came forward. Then parents. One by one they approached him. Not with fear, but with gratitude. A father shook his hand and said, Thank you for being honest with her. A mother hugged him briefly and whispered, My sister's in heaven too. What you said, that was exactly right. An elderly man stepped forward, his eyes damp. I judged you. We all did. I'm sorry for that. Danwoo stood frozen, overwhelmed by kindness he didn't know how to process. His whole life had been built on fear and respect earned through violence. But this soft, genuine acceptance, he had no framework for it. His phone buzzed. A text from his consigliera. We need to talk. Now. Danwoo excused himself and stepped away from the crowd, his bodyguards forming a barrier. He made the call. Have you lost your mind? His consigliera's voice was sharp. It's everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Mafia boss cries with little girl. The Kozlov brothers are already making jokes. They think you've gone soft. Maybe I have, Danwoo said quietly. Silence on the other end. Then, soft bosses don't stay bosses for long. Soft bosses end up dead. Danwoo looked back at Zoe, who was laughing now, showing her grandmother something on a store window. He watched families moving through the mall. Fathers carrying children on their shoulders, mothers holding hands with toddlers, elderly couples sharing pretzels on benches. Simple moments of joy he'd stopped noticing years ago. When had he stopped seeing people as people? When had everyone become either threats or assets? I'll handle it, Danwoo said and ended the call. But even as he said it, he knew something fundamental had shifted. He didn't want to go back to the life where a little girl asking about her mother would have meant nothing to him, where tears were weakness and kindness was a vulnerability to exploit. He didn't want Zoe to grow up and hear his name whispered with fear. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket, feeling the small weight of it against his chest. That night, he'd start making arrangements. Anonymous scholarships for Zoe's education. Monthly support for Margaret Chin. Donations to grief counseling centers for children. All in honor of a little girl who'd seen past his reputation and found something worth saving. And in honor of his mother, who died believing he could be good. Danwoo looked at the crowds of Christmas shoppers and felt something in his chest unlock. A warmth he'd thought was lost forever. For the first time in 20 years, he wanted to be worthy of his mother's faith. Even if it meant walking away from everything he'd built. 4 months later, Danwoo stood outside Meadowbrook Elementary School, watching children pour through the front doors like colorful confetti. It was early December again, and the air smelled like snow that hadn't fallen yet. He kept his distance, leaning against his car with his hands in his coat pockets, scanning the crowd for a particular green bough. The past 4 months had been the most dangerous of his life. Severing ties with the organization meant making enemies of men who'd once been allies. There had been threats, close calls, one attempt on his life that his bodyguards had barely intercepted. But every time Danwoo questioned whether walking away was worth it, he remembered Zoe's small hand in his and knew he couldn't go back. Some things once seen couldn't be unseen. Some doors once opened couldn't be closed. Then he spotted her. Zoe came running down the school steps, her backpack bouncing, that same bright green bough holding back her curls. She was laughing at something her friend said, and the sound carried across the schoolyard like music. Danwoo felt his chest tighten with relief. She looked healthy, happy, thriving. Margaret Chin had called him twice to say the anonymous donations weren't necessary, that it was too much, but Danwoo had insisted. Zoe's school tuition was covered. Margaret's medical bills were paid. The apartment they'd been about to lose was secure. It was the least he could do, though he suspected Margaret knew exactly who was behind the anonymous support. Zoe saw him and froze mid-step. Then her whole face lit up. "Mr. Danwoo." She ran toward him, and Danwoo crouched down just in time for her to barrel into him with a hug that nearly knocked him over. He caught her laughing, actually laughing, and steadied them both. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "How's school?" "It's good. Really good." Zoe pulled back, her eyes shining with excitement. "Wait, I have to show you something." She dropped her backpack and dug through it frantically, pulling out crumpled papers and a half-eaten sandwich before finally finding what she was looking for. "Look, I made this in art class." She held up a drawing, and Danwoo's breath caught. It was a picture of Santa Claus, clearly him, with dark eyes visible even through the beard, kneeling on a platform. In Santa's hands was a bright red heart with wings. Above him, sketched in careful child's handwriting, were the words "To Heaven with Love." And in the corner, a small figure with a green bough held Santa's hand. "I drew you," Zoe said proudly. "Mrs. Anderson said it was the most beautiful picture in the whole class. She asked me what it meant, and I told her about how you helped me send love to my mom." She cried a little. Zoe giggled. "Teachers cry more than you think." Danwoo stared at the drawing, his vision blurring. In Zoe's eyes, he wasn't a criminal or a reformed mobster or a man with blood on his hands. He was just someone who'd been kind when she needed kindness most. Someone who'd understood her grief because he carried his own. "It's perfect," Danwoo managed, his voice rough. "Can I keep it?" "Of course." Zoe beamed. "I made it for you." Danwoo carefully folded the drawing and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I have something for you too." Zoe's eyes widened as he opened the pouch and pulled out the silver bracelet, the one she'd given him 4 months ago. But now, alongside the small heart charm, there was a new addition, a delicate angel wing, gleaming in the afternoon light. "You kept it," Zoe whispered. "I did. It helped me through some hard times." Danwoo took her small hand and placed the bracelet in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "But I think it should be yours now. Your mom is your angel, Zoe. She's watching over you every day, so proud of how strong and kind you are." He paused, his throat tight. "And you saved someone too. You saved me." Zoe looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. The good kind, the kind that came from happiness too big to contain. "Really? Really?" Danwoo touched the green bough in her hair gently. "You reminded me what it feels like to be human. I'd forgotten." Zoe threw her arms around his neck again, and Danwoo held her close, this small girl who'd cracked open his heart and let the light back in. Over her shoulder, he saw Margaret Chin approaching slowly, a knowing smile on her face. She nodded at him, a gesture of trust, of gratitude, of understanding. "Mr. Danwoo?" Zoe pulled back, still holding the bracelet. "Are you coming to our winter concert next week?" "It's at the school. I'm singing in the choir." Danwoo hesitated. Public events still made him nervous. Old enemies. New vulnerabilities. But looking at Zoe's hopeful face, he knew there was only one answer. "I'll be there. Front row." 1 week later, Danwoo sat in a tiny plastic chair in Meadowbrook Elementary's gymnasium, surrounded by parents holding phone cameras and grandparents wiping happy tears. The choir stood on risers at the front, 20 children in matching red and green shirts, and right in the center of the front row was Zoe, her green bough perfectly placed. The piano began, and small voices filled the room with silent night. Danwoo watched Zoe sing, her face serious with concentration, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Peace. Not the absence of danger. There would always be danger for a man with his past, but a deeper peace. The kind that came from choosing to be better, from walking away from violence and towards something that actually mattered, from honoring his mother's memory not through power, but through protection. Under his shirt, hidden from view, Danwoo wore the angel wing charm on a thin chain. He'd had it duplicated before returning the bracelet to Zoe. Now it rested against his chest, close to his heart, a constant reminder that redemption was possible, that even the most broken things could be made whole if someone cared enough to try. The song ended, and the audience applauded. Zoe's eyes found his in the crowd, and she waved excitedly. Danwoo waved back, smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made his face feel strange because he'd gone so long without it. A father sitting next to him leaned over. "Which one's yours?" Danwoo looked at Zoe, strong, bright, brave, singing her heart out with her whole life ahead of her, and felt his chest swell with something that felt dangerously close to pride. "The one with the green bow," he said softly. As the next song began and children's voices rose toward the gymnasium ceiling, Danwoo closed his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. A little girl who asked Santa to send her love to heaven had ended up saving a man who thought he lived in hell. She'd given him the one gift he never thought he deserved: redemption. And for the first time since his mother died, Danwoo believed his life could still become something beautiful, just like she'd always said it would. Every Danwoo needs a Zoe. Every hardened heart needs one moment of grace. Who in your life has been your Zoe? The person who saw past your walls and reminded you of your goodness. Share this story and tag them. Let them know they made a difference.